Hello! Welcome to a video about the library called Annyang. That's a word in Korean, I believe, and I'm not 100% sure that I'm getting the pronunciation correct. It means hello. And what is Annyang? It is a library that's designed to make it easier to do speech recognition in your browser, which is pretty neat. So what we're going to do with this library is we're just going to do the usual thing, right? How do we learn about it? And then how do we experiment with it and get it working in a JavaScript project of our own? So a key thing that's worth knowing is that Annyang it's there to accomplish speech recognition for us in the browser. But very, very few browsers actually support speech recognition, and effectively it's pretty much limited to Chrome. So when you're working with Annyang, if you have been using a different browser, like Firefox, for example, you're going to need to use Chrome. And you're going to need to tell people to use Chrome when they look at projects in which you have been using Annyang. Okay? So that's important to remember. It's a compatibility thing, right? Annyang is built on top of the Web Speech API, but what it does, very thankfully, is it makes it easier to use. So it's about facilitating using a feature that exists in some browsers, notably Chrome, and making it much, much easier for you to use. So let's run through our standard encounter with a library steps, okay? So for this time, we're doing it for Annyang. So how do we meet a library? The first thing we do is we go to its homepage. Annyang's homepage is at talater.com/Annyang. And what we do then is we're looking for resources, and in particular, examples of using the library and its API. Then we want to get the library, put it in a project of our own, and start playing around with some of the possibilities that it represents, but really most especially just kind of get it working so that we can then start having ideas. Okay, so let's meet Annyang. Let's go to its homepage at talater.com/Annyang. So here is the Annyang website. One thing that you'll notice if you go to the Annyang website for the first time is that it's going to ask you if it can access the microphone. And you should obviously allow that, give it permission, because it relies on having access to the microphone in order to do speech recognition. Otherwise, there's no point. So if you do allow it, then this is the Annyang website that you'll see. And right away, we understand what it is for, right? Annyang, speech recognition that just works, a tiny JavaScript library that lets your visitors control your site with voice commands. Supports multiple languages, has no dependencies, and weighs just 2 kilobytes and is free. So lots of lovely features. When they say that it weighs 2 kilobytes, they're just talking about the size of the file that represents the library. So it's nice and small, which is definitely a good thing. And really the key thing is this, right? It lets your visitors, I guess that's how we're thinking of the people who are using our program, control the site with voice commands. So it's about voice commands. We can actually think about it more broadly than that, but it's a good kind of mental model to have, that it's about commands. And then right away, we see go ahead, try it, and we're going to try and do this. And my apologies in advance if things go haywire. Speech recognition is not a perfect art, but I'm going to try it out now. Hello. Hello. There we go. Second time was the charm. So you can see that I said hello, and it brought up some text onto the webpage that says Annyang, which is it saying hello back in Korean. So it works, right? I said a word. I didn't click anything. I didn't use my hands for anything. It literally heard me say the word hello, and it changed something on the web page. And that, in terms of total fundamentals, that is what this library is actually for, okay? You say something, and JavaScript can then react in some way. We can see that the examples continue below. Let's try something more interesting. So it's got some more suggestions. Show me cute kittens. Show me cute kittens. There we go. Okay, so that worked. So you can see what's happening there, which is a little bit potentially interesting. Is that it's gone to the Flickr API. I happen to know Flickr is a photo sharing service, and it's gone and found pictures of the thing I asked for, cute kittens, right? But you can see here, that the point of this is that it's not pre-programmed, right? It's not that they've pre-programmed kittens in Arches National Park. You can actually say, show me anything, and at least in theory, it will go and find that and show it to you. So I could say something like, show me Charlie Brown. Show me Charlie Brown. And then I get pictures of Charlie Brown from Peanuts, right? You can see already that I've had to repeat myself a couple of times. It is not a perfect science, the speech recognition thing, and you're going to need to be ready for it not to recognize things perfectly every single time. This is especially true in a situation like this where I'm talking. The rest of the time I'm not talking to Annyang, I'm talking to you, and then suddenly I start talking to Annyang. That can be a little bit difficult for the speech recognition engine. But you can see that it works, right? And this step is kind of amazing because I'm issuing a voice command and it's listening to me, but I can say anything and it can respond to the anything that I say, like Charlie Brown in this particular case. Okay, so amazing. And now we really know what it does. You say a command and the website or JavaScript underneath the website is able to respond. So now we know what Annyang is for and how it works. Now we're excited, presumably, that we want to control our programs with our voices, and so now our job is to look for resources. So let's keep scrolling down the homepage. Because in this case, actually, there's no menu system at the top here, right? So we're going to have to keep scrolling if we want to find something. Oh, and there's one last one here, which is show TPS report. Oh, very fancy. Okay, so, and that kind of animated something onto the screen, right? The TPS report in question animated onto the screen. How cool. So how did you do that? Simple, apparently. Here is all the code needed to achieve that. And so here we have what you will often see with most libraries, which is sort of what they think of as the simplest possible example of using their library, okay? And it's really important, especially as, if you're in an early stage as a developer in a language like JavaScript, what people think is simple is not always simple to you, and that is completely fine. If you look at this example and it looks completely unintelligible or kind of unintelligible, that's fine. That's something that we get used to over time. So because this is presented as the main example, let's actually look at this in a little bit of detail and really start trying to understand what are the pieces needed to use Annyang. So what do we have? Well, the first thing that we have, which is very useful, is a script tag that tells us how to include the library in a project. We're familiar with this being the way that we include JavaScript libraries in our index.html, right? We have a script tag that links to the file that contains the library. And here is an example of that, okay? The only thing that you might not have seen here before is this double slash with no protocol. There's no HTTP and there's no HTTPS in front of this. What it turns out this means is if you don't include HTTP and a colon or HTTPS and a colon, it will use whatever you are currently using when it loads this page. So if you were using HTTPS on the site, that's what it will use to access the library, and vice versa if you are already using HTTP. So just a convenient thing you may or may not actually care about. So this is good because we know if we want to get our own project started, this is the key thing that we're going to need to copy into our index.html in order to be able to use Annyang. You can also see we do not need an API key or any way of identifying ourselves. It's just free and it just exists for us to use. So that's part one, useful. Then we have the actual code that is used to do something. And if we kind of look at it a little bit, we can see the mention of TPS report here. So this is the code that's being used to animate that TPS report onto the screen, which is like a little picture of some documents. So there's quite a bit going on here, and I just want to take it step by step so that we don't get overwhelmed. So the first thing that we see here is an if statement. And that if is around the entire amount of code. So all of this code is inside this if statement. And that if statement says if Annyang, and then if Annyang, whatever Annyang is true, then it will do all of the Annyang stuff, and if it's false or not true, then it won't do all of the Annyang stuff. And what this is doing, which is not explained here, is checking whether Annyang is actually available in this browser. Is speech recognition even available in the browser? Because if it's not, there's actually no point in doing any of the other stuff, right? Because we need to be using Chrome, This is a moment where we could potentially check, like, are they using the wrong browser, right? If Annyang is not true, then we know they're using the wrong browser. So this is a good example of something that comes up quite a bit in web programming and other kinds of programming, where you kind of need to make sure that the user has got the right setup to even continue on with the program. So if Annyang is true, we have Annyang, it's going to work, then we can do all of this stuff to actually use Annyang in our program, okay? The next thing that we see is a variable called commands. And because you, of course, prefer using ES6 or later versions of JavaScript, you would notice that this says var here, but we should say let here because we find that to be a cooler way of declaring variables. So this should say let commands. And we're assigning into this variable, so presumably this is a variable that's going to represent the commands I can give to Annyang. We're assigning into that an object, and we can tell that it's an object because it's in these curly brackets, right? And this is like a real exercise in deciphering JavaScript syntax, so it's a good exercise for us to be doing. So we've got an object that's going into this commands variable. We can tell because of the curly brackets. And then inside that object, there's a property called show TPS report, right? And it's in quote marks, you may notice there. The reason that it's in quote marks is because it has spaces in it, and if you're writing it without quote marks, you couldn't have the spaces. And the reason that there are spaces inside it is because this is what you need to say to Annyang to trigger the response, okay? So that's the way that Annyang is working, is that the property name inside this object, or any of the property names if you have more than one, is the thing that you say. So if you say show TPS report, that's going to trigger this command. And what does it trigger? It triggers a function. So if Annyang hears this property name, this command, show TPS report, it calls this function. Now this is an anonymous function, right? So here we haven't given it the name of a function to call, we've given it the definition of a function to run. And so it's an anonymous function because it has no name. And this is very, very typical in a lot of JavaScript that you're going to see. So very important to get used to this, okay? So all that we're seeing here is that when you say show TPS report, this function, this unnamed function here, is going to run. And what's it going to do? Inside that function is one line of code right here. And this is what's going to execute or happen when the user says show TPS report. And this is kind of freaky because this is written in a kind of JavaScript that you may not have run into before called Jquery. And what Jquery is good at doing is all kinds of stuff with web pages. And in this particular case, it's animating the picture of the TPS report up from the bottom by -100 pixels. That's what it's doing. So it's animating that picture to come onto the screen. That's what that means. It doesn't matter to us right now because we're not using Jquery right now. The key thing really to know is that when you say show TPS report, which is the name of the property, it's going to do whatever is inside the function that you provide. You could provide a name of a function that's defined later on, or you can provide an anonymous function and have it list the code to execute right there. Okay, so a little bit complicated, but what we have essentially is a variable that's got an object in it, and that has a property with a function in it that will be executed for that command. That's a fairly large amount to take in, but it gets easier as you do it more and more often, right? The next thing that we see is Annyang.addCommands. So this is a key step when we're using Annyang, is that we have to tell Annyang, this Annyang object that represents the library, Annyang, that we want to add that command that we just defined. Because here we've just created a variable called commands, right? So that's information. We have to give that information to Annyang, and we do that with this add commands method. So Annyang.addCommands, which commands? The ones inside the variable called commands. So this stuff gets given to Annyang. Otherwise, Annyang's not going to know what to listen for, right? The final step that we see here is Annyang.Start, and as you can see, this says start listening, right? So this is the moment at which Annyang starts trying to access the microphone of the user's computer and starts listening for this command, show TPS report. Until you call start, Annyang is not listening, okay? So you have to call that at some point, and this is the moment when you call this function, or method, this is the moment when it would pop up that permission box if permission hadn't already been granted, right? So a lot going on there, but really, really pretty useful to see all of the bits and pieces that it takes to get one basic Annyang command working, but very powerful, right? Because from this, we can kind of extrapolate that we could have any command in here, inside these quote marks. We could say whatever we want, and any function here that could do whatever we want. So we're connecting saying and doing. We're connecting the user saying words to the program executing a function. And that is what Annyang is for. Okay? So that example is actually super helpful. I stepped through this slowly because it's a little bit intense, and it's really important and good before you use a library to try and get the sense of, okay, I understand how this is working. So below it says, what about more complicated commands? It's worth just having a quick glance at this, just at least in terms of what can be done. And we can see that there are a few extra things it can do. One is apparently that it can use variables inside what the user says, which is kind of interesting. Another is these things called splats, which the term splat is pretty funny, which can capture multi-word text at the end of a command. Okay, so it can listen to what you say and kind of remember what you say. That's pretty interesting. And we can also have optional words or phrases. And then below we've got, again, some code that actually does this. And in fact, we've seen this one, right? The show me one was searching Flickr. So we can see that the way that that's being achieved is show me, and then it's got this asterisk and the word tag. And what it's saying is, if you hear show me, then save everything that they say after show me and send that to the show Flickr function. That it can then use that to search for those things, right? So show me, and then if I say cute kittens, then cute kittens gets remembered in this special tag variable and given to the show Flickr function to go search for it on Flickr. Then we have a similar thing, which is the named variable, where we can have a single word. So calculate and then a variable, month stats. So if I say calculate January stats, then month is going to be set to January. If I say calculate oogledy-doogledy stats, then month is going to be set to oogledy-doogledy, which is probably not very useful, and passed through to this calculate stats function. Okay. And then finally, we have this idea of optional text in a command. So if we put some text in parentheses, it's optional. So I could either say hello to my little friend, and that would trigger the greeting, or I can say hello friend, and that would also trigger the greeting because to my little is optional. So it's just worth seeing that, just so that we know that these are possibilities. We don't have to use every single part of a library. It's often useful to get a sense of what's there, though. Okay, so let's continue scrolling. Annyang plays nicely with all browsers, progressively enhancing browsers that support speech recognition, Okay, so that's great. And then right at the bottom, which I find kind of unusual, but I guess they want you to kind of read through the whole page, we have some actual nitty-gritty about how to use Annyang. So we can see here that there's an option for downloading the library here. Grab the latest version of annyang.min.js. So if you want the actual file version of Annyang, you can go and get it here, and you can drag that into your libraries folder of your project, and you can use a script tag to link to that file, right? That's useful, especially if you want to work in situations where you don't have the internet. For my purposes today, I'm just going to use the URL version that we saw earlier. You can visit Annyang on GitHub. So they're hosting all of the code for Annyang on GitHub. If you happen to want to look at how Annyang works under the hood, you can go look at its source code here. And then, very importantly for us, read the full API documentation. So we really care about that, right? API documentation, that's always what we're looking for when we are trying to understand how to use a library. So I'm going to open that page over there in a new tab. And there's also an FAQ that's probably worth casting our eyes over. So I'm going to open that one as well. And now I'm going to leave the Annyang site for now. Okay, so we're going to go over here, and now we're in the API reference. So they've already, at the top of this document, they're saying the quickest way to get started is to visit the homepage. That's where we were, and that was pretty useful. So we got a lot of information out of just reading the homepage. If we are seeing this, we're seeing this API now, so we know the basics of how Annyang works. For example, we've seen this add commands method before, and we understand roughly what that does. What reading the API can give us a lot of the time is just some extra detail. And we don't always have to just read it. We can also, of course, refer back to it if we want to understand something, but it's always worth kind of scrolling through and just checking what's around, right? So one thing that we might notice is in the description of the add commands method, it add commands that Annyang will respond to. That makes sense. This is interesting, doesn't remove existing commands. So that means, therefore, and this is what we can see in the example below, that we can add multiple sets of commands cumulatively if we want to. And that could be something that we might want to remember. Let's continue on. Start is the thing that actually starts the listening. There are some extra sort of complex things that we can set as options when we start. Most of them seem like things that we should just leave alone, though. They're a little bit complicated, so we'll just leave that stuff alone. There's an abort that seems to be to completely cancel out of Annyang altogether and turn off the microphone. That could be a polite thing to do at some point. Maybe if you're wanting to give the user the chance to opt out of being listened to by clicking a button, you could then call this abort method. There is a pause and a resume, so you don't have to keep listening all the time to the user. You could pause listening and then resume it later on, it looks like, so that could be pretty useful. There's debug output, okay. There is language setting, so that's an interesting thing to know there, right? Like that you could listen to different languages. So if you want your program to respond to French, you should set the language to be French instead of to US English as it is right now. We can remove commands. That could be useful if we're wanting to kind of disable a set of commands that are no longer relevant, so we should remember that. One big thing in Annyang that let's not go through all of this, but it's worth noticing because it's such a common thing in all libraries, is the idea of different callbacks that might be relevant. So we've got this add callback method, and this is so that we can listen to specific kinds of events that happen in Annyang and call specific functions when they happen. So just as an example, there's a callback for start, and that would happen as soon as the Annyang has successfully started, right? It's when it's actually listening. So we could, if we want to, call a function specifically when we know that Annyang has just started listening. Maybe it should display a message, right? That's like, I'm listening to you now, or something like that, right? Similarly, here we have one called Soundstart. That will be called as soon as Annyang thinks that it is hearing some sound that it might be trying to interpret as speech. And the list goes on, right? We can also, for example, this result no match. That's kind of interesting. So the user says something, but Annyang does not recognize that as one of its commands. We can still pay attention to that and be notified and call a function when something was said that didn't match a command. That could be interesting as well, right? If the user kind of got it wrong in some sense, you might want to taunt them for getting it wrong, or something like you didn't guess the secret word or something, right? If you want to be able to respond to them not saying one of the commands, you might need to use this result no match. And so the point here is not to memorize all of this stuff, but just to cast our eyes over it and have a sense of what's available when we are going to be using this library. So again, there's some examples down here that show us how that might be done. We can remove callbacks as well, so we can stop paying attention to specific kinds of events. We can check if Annyang is currently listening. That's probably pretty useful. Getting the speech recognizer, that's about the kind of underlying browser stuff. We wouldn't worry about that. This is actually worth remembering. This trigger method means that we can pretend that the user said something by just typing in some text. That could be really useful just if we're sick of sitting in our room alone at midnight saying things to our computer and we just want to trigger off things with text input instead. That could be good. Init, that seems like, okay, so it gives a bunch of commands to Annyang, but it also removes everything that was previously there. That could be nice. And then there's some other stuff down here that's good to know. And this is the same documentation about this idea of named variables, splats, and optional words. So that's that documentation that's there again. And then there's some even more complicated stuff here around regular expressions, which I'm going to ignore. But if you're interested in regular expressions and you read this and want to know more, we can, of course, talk about that. Okay, so we've now read the API. We are feeling very good about ourselves, very informed. Let's just take a quick look. So the frequently asked questions could be useful. You might just sort of see something interesting in here that you want to know about. This is the one that caught my eye. Can Annyang be used to capture the full text spoken by the user? So no matter what the user says, you manage to grab that text and use it for something. The answer is yes, and you can read the answer to the question if you are interested in that as well. So there are just a few common things, I guess, that people are asking about Annyang that you might want answered. Okay. So goodness me, so we've done a lot of reading now. how are we going to actually use Annyang? So once again, we want to get hold of the library. So I'm going to go back to talater.com. And the way that I'm going to use it is I'm not going to download it. Remember that at the bottom of the page here, you could download the library here. And I welcome you to do that if you want to. But what I'm going to do is the easier version, which I'm just going to copy their script tag here. Okay, so I'm going to copy that script tag, and then I'm going to use that in a project. And I, as you might imagine, already have a project open. So over here, I have a P5 project. This is just the template as per usual. And I'm going to paste that script tag into my index.html. So if you don't have one already started that you want to use, you should make sure that you get hold of a template P5 project if you want to copy me, and then paste that link that I just pasted into your index.html, or download the file and link to the copy of the library that you copied into your libraries folder. While I'm here, I'm also going to replace the title of the page, Annyang, ! So by putting this line in, I've included Annyang. I'm ready to start doing some voice recognition. So let us try this out. We know the basics of how it works because we've seen them from the home page. So let's actually put this in. So again, just in the interests of not taking up too much screen real estate, I'm going to delete the comments. Obviously, I wouldn't do this for a production. And I'm going to create a canvas. And I'm going to set a background color just so that we've got, like something going on. And now I want to use Annyang. So the first question here is, and maybe I'll quickly go back for the millionth time to their homepage. We know the basic form of how it works is this thing here, right? I could just copy and paste this in, but what I'll do is I'll type it in piece by piece, okay? So remember that we do if Annyang. We define our commands as a property and a function, we add them, and we start Annyang. So those are the 4 steps. If I feel like if I paste this in, I'm just pasting in code I don't really get. So here we go. So a key thing I think to think about here is where do I want to do the Annyang setup stuff? And I hope at least that the fairly obvious answer is that we should do it in setup, right? Because we want to set up Annyang and its commands when our program starts. And so we should do that here. So the first thing I was supposed to do is check if Annyang is available. So I have an if statement, and I say if Annyang. If it's not available, then I'm in trouble already, and my program shouldn't really do anything. Then I know that I want to create a commands object. I'll call it commands, even though I'm just going to have one command to start with, and that's going to be an object, so it's going to be in curly brackets with properties inside it here. Then I need to have a command. So they had show TPS report, right? Show TPS report. They had like that. I don't want to say that. So I'm just going to say hello. That's a nice simple thing for it to recognize. And then I need a function that should execute if they say hello. And I'm going to write this as an anonymous function. As I said, and as they have examples of in the API, you could also use a named function here. So we've got a function, and this is what's going to be called when it hears hello. What do I want to do when I say hello? I'm just going to trigger an alert. So alert, what am I going to say? I'm going to say howdy. Oh, with some slightly poor capitalization. So if it hears hello, it's going to run this function in its property called hello. That's going to trigger an alert that says howdy. So it's going to respond. I'll know if it worked or not based on this, right? So that gives me my commands. The next thing is to add the commands to Annyang with the add commands method. So Annyang.add commands, and then the commands variable that I just created. And the final thing is to start speech recognition. So Annyang.start was the name of that method. And then I save, and that's it. So that's a program that uses Annyang, and that uses the core functionality right away. So I want to then go packages, live server, start server. And here we actually run into an issue that I want to point to, which is that here we have 2 browser windows that are kind of using the microphone. I generally find it safer to close any other window that is also attempting to use the microphone potentially, just so that you only have one open. And we can see the little record button here is telling me that my window is listening to the microphone. And if I hadn't been playing with Annyang previously, it would have asked for permission, and I would have had to have granted the permission. So it's sitting here, and it's listening to me. I should really open my JavaScript console just to make sure that there's no errors. There are no errors down here, so that's really amazing to see. And now I need to try and see if this works. So, hello. It works, right? There is my little message, and it says howdy. So that's that alert function being called with the text howdy in it in response to my voice saying hello. So again, reviewing how that works, we created a commands object. The property name is the thing that I'm supposed to say, hello. And then after that, we have the function that should be called when I say it, which is this anonymous function that calls an alert that then says howdy. That's what pops up that message that says howdy. And as I've been saying, this could also, we could take that away, and instead we could have a function called something like say hello, and we could define that function, sorry, functino, that function down here, say hello, alert, hello there. Same thing, right? And what you feel more comfortable with is fine here. It's really up to you whether you use an anonymous function or you use a named function, whatever seems like a more intelligible way to you. So this works the same way. Hello. See, it still works, right? So it heard me say hello, and it called the say hello function, and that triggered this alert. So both ways are completely fine by me. Okay, so that means that we've got it working, right? We can give it a command, and it will call a function for us. And we could, I'm going to go back to the anonymous version just because I slightly prefer it. When the function is really, really small, like when it's just calling one line of code, right, the alert, I find it's easier to just have it in the same place as the command here. So I know that hello triggers an alert that says howdy. I just find that a little clearer personally. So if I wanted to add another one, here's the first command, right? The command and then the function. Then I have a comma, and then I can write the next one. Maybe if I say goodbye, I have a function that says ciao. Ciao bella. Maybe I should say ciao bella. And now I've got two commands that my page can listen to. Hello. Howdy. Goodbye. Ciao bella. So it works. You know, it works. And that's kind of it, right? Like, I mean, that's, in a sense, that's what we can do with Annyang. We can have specific commands and the things that they do, and that's it. And you can imagine if you had, for example, voice synthesis, it could talk back to you literally in a voice. So it could say ciao bella in a terrible Italian accent, or a really great Italian accent. I don't actually know how the browser's Italian is. So in a sense, that's it. However, let's take it a step further. And let's sort of integrate this a little bit more into P5. So I'm going to copy some code over rather than just type it in front of you. So rather than things that are just triggering kind of browser alerts, we could imagine a program that's like the classic P5 light switch program, right? Where we have a variable called on that determines whether the light is on or off. Starts off as false, so the light is off. And then in Annyang, we're going to have these commands that change whether on is true or false. So if I say turn the light on, then on becomes true. And if I say turn the light off, then on becomes false. And I do the same standard set of things, right? This is exactly the same idea of defining the commands, adding the commands here and starting Annyang here. And the big difference is that I use the information in draw to set the background. So I set the background to white if the light is on, and I set the background to black if the light is off. So we have a kind of a clapper. Turn the light on. Turn the light off. Indeed. And you think you can hear that a weird voice that you often use when you talk to your computer. You like lose all of the emotion in your voice because you're worried it's not going to understand you. And I don't know. Will it? So let's see. I'll try and say it in a friendly way. Turn the light on. Turn the light off. Huh, okay, so there's some possibility of expressiveness in your voice when you talk to it. You can remember that. So you can have like a little acting session with your computer, right? But that's kind of it. Just to kind of make this maybe a little bit more interesting, I'm going to paste in another program that's kind of almost the same thing. Let's switch back over here and I'll paste it in. Oh, I lost my use strict. Let's never do that. Use strict at the top. So this is the same idea. We're just going to switch something between two options. So we've got a face, and that's going to be a little emoticon, sorry, of a neutral face to begin with. And we're going to display that face. It's rotated, and it's got a few things applied to it to make it look like that, but that's just that emoticon being displayed. And what we're going to do with Annyang is if I say I love you, then it's going to call a function called love, and if I say I hate you, it's going to call a function called hate. And again, other than that, this is exactly the same structure, right? We're not changing anything about how we're using Annyang. In draw, we're just rotating and drawing that text on the screen, so nothing new there. And then just like the light switch, right? If it calls the love function, it changes to a happy emoticon. If it calls the hate function, it changes to a sad emoticon. So let's try that out. I love you. I love you. Ah, I hate you. I hate you. There's a delayed response there as it thought about what I was thinking. I love you. I love you. So that was interesting too, what we saw there, right? Like that there was some kind of lag, and that may be to do with like atmospheric noise. It's a bit hard to say. I hate you. I hate you. I'm not really sure what the delay is there, but it's very satisfying. And I guess like the point of this example really is just depending on what you do and what you ask the user to say, because speech is super personal. It's not just complete neutrality, right? Depending on what you say and how the computer reacts, you can have these actually very emotional, potentially social relationships with your program. Like it feels different to tell this poor little face that I hate it or I love it and see it respond. That's very different to turning a light switch on and off, even though the code itself inherently is kind of the same thing. There's not a big difference in terms of what I'm actually executing under the hood. It's all about kind of aesthetics at that point. And that's worth thinking about too, right? Like how can you kind of use interesting aesthetics to create sort of effective responses. So I'm gonna wrap it up there. Actually, there's some more stuff in the notes about using those splats. I'll let you explore that at your own speed. Again, I want to try and keep these videos not too super duper long, and you can have fun with that as you wish. So a couple of notes just before we kind of wind up. Let me show you my beautiful face. And we've seen both of these things while we've been playing around. One is, I think it's safer to only have one tab open that's using the microphone at once because you can end up with conflicts between them. So generally make sure that you've only got one tab or window using the microphone at a time to avoid problems. And the other, which I think we saw, is the speech recognition isn't perfect. It's not going to understand you every single time, and it's not going to get it right every single time. The environment can be too noisy. It could be your accent. It could be that you have a cold. Maybe your computer is just in a bad mood. It can be hard to say. But it's clearly a ton of fun to play around with and refreshingly simple, right? That it's just like if you say a thing, then a specific function can be called, and that's what it does for us. So again, the impetus now is to think about what can I do with this? What's exciting about using this particular tool that is known as Annyang. I'll see you in the next video.